Most people think they fail because they lack motivation. But what if the truth is darker? What if motivation itself is the trap designed to make you fail? That rush of energy you feel on Monday morning is the same drug that betrays you by Friday night. The dopamine spike is temporary, and when it fades, you're left with the same negotiation in your head. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. That negotiation is where consistency dies, and once you understand that, you'll never look at self-discipline the same way again. The Zen master Dogen called it goji, practice without gaps, a principle so extreme that even monks described it as terrifying. It doesn't ask you to try harder. It doesn't rely on willpower or motivation. It removes the fight completely until practice continues by itself, like a river that never stops flowing. It's the reason some men can train for decades without missing a single day, while the rest of us collapse after a week of new year, new me. Think about it. Every system you've ever tried to build your life on has been designed to fail because it asks you to bargain with yourself every morning. At 5 a.m., the debate begins. I'm too tired. I'll double tomorrow. I'll start again next week. You've been tricked into believing you can negotiate with the part of yourself that wants comfort, but that voice never loses. Samurai understood this centuries ago. That's why they carved their vows into wood, sometimes even written in their own blood. There was no "I'll try again tomorrow." It was done, or it was death. Extreme, absolutely. But psychology now proves what the warriors already knew. Your brain categorizes every commitment into two boxes: reversible and irreversible. Reversible commitments get executed. Irreversible commitments get executed. That's why writing a goal in a journal dies in private silence, while a vow shouted in public burns your ego if you break it. Look at modern parallels. A Navy SEAL doesn't get to debate whether Hell Week feels convenient. An Olympic gymnast doesn't negotiate with her body when the bell rings. And in your life, it's the same reason businesses collapse, diets fail, and resolutions evaporate. You're living in the box of reversibility. Dogen's system was designed to drag you out of that box and lock the door behind you. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because when you finally begin to live without gaps, when you declare a practice that doesn't allow negotiation, people will start calling you obsessive. They'll whisper that you've gone too far. But the truth is, you've simply entered the territory where normal people can't follow. And that's the point. Because the kind of consistency that makes others uncomfortable is exactly the consistency that rewires who you are. But how do you begin? How do you build a system that eliminates negotiation entirely? It starts with a single step, and the first principle might shock you. Motivation is your enemy, not your friend. The death of motivation. Motivation is the most overrated drug of the modern age. You've been told it's your secret weapon, the spark that ignites discipline. But in reality, motivation is the silent assassin of consistency. It gives you a burst of false energy, then abandons you the moment you need it most. It tricks you into believing you're on the right path, only to betray you the second life gets inconvenient. That's why Monday mornings feel invincible, and Friday nights feel like surrender. Motivation is adrenaline, disguised as commitment, and adrenaline runs out. The real problem isn't that you lack motivation, it's that you rely on it at all. Neuroscience proves this. When you set a new goal, dopamine floods your brain. You feel excited. That chemical surge convinces you that change has already begun. But the brain is ruthless. Once novelty fades, dopamine levels crash, leaving you weaker than before. The system that was supposed to empower you actually ensures your collapse. It's the reason gyms are packed in January and empty in March. Motivation isn't fuel, it's poison disguised as progress. Dogen understood this centuries ago. He saw how monks struggled when their practice depended on feeling ready. So he built goji, practice without gaps, practice that continues without asking your permission. He stripped motivation from the equation entirely, because once you make discipline conditional on emotion, you've already lost. The enemy isn't laziness. The enemy is the negotiation that begins every time you ask yourself, do I feel like it today? Think about that internal dialogue. At 5 a.m., your alarm rings. One voice whispers, just this once, stay in bed, you're tired, tomorrow will be better. Another voice whispers, get up, don't break the streak. But one voice always wins, and it's rarely the voice of discipline. This is the exact moment where dreams die. Not in dramatic failures, but in quiet negotiations with yourself that you pretend don't matter. Samurai had no tolerance for this negotiation. They knew that the human mind, when given an option, always chooses comfort. So they created vows that stripped the option away. Some vows were carved into wood. Others were signed in blood. They transformed promises from reversible to irreversible. When a commitment is reversible, your mind will always debate it. But when it becomes irreversible, when your pride, your reputation, your honor on the line, there is no debate. It simply gets done. Modern psychology calls this a commitment device. Skin in the game. Put something you value at risk, and suddenly failure becomes unthinkable. Look at entrepreneurs. They put money on the line, risking ruin to build businesses. Look at athletes. They put their bodies on the line, training through pain because stopping means humiliation in front of millions. The ancient samurai weren't different. They understood that when the price of failure is higher than the price of effort, effort becomes inevitable. Ichigo learned this lesson the hard way. For years he wanted to build a meditation practice. Smart programmer, successful career, plenty of ambition, but ambition is nothing without structure. Every attempt followed the same pattern. Monday motivation, Wednesday negotiation, Friday collapse, Sunday promises about next week. Over and over the cycle repeated. The reason wasn't laziness. It was the reversible nature of his commitment. He was negotiating every single morning and losing every single time. Then he discovered Jukai, the Zen tradition of making vows before the entire community. Not vague intentions, not I'll try harder, but identity-level declarations. I am someone who meditates. I am someone who trains. The monks weren't promising to attempt. They were declaring who they were. And when your identity is at stake, quitting becomes unthinkable. So Ichigo followed their example. He wrote down his vow, 20 minutes of meditation every morning for 90 days, the length of a traditional Ango retreat. He signed it. He posted it publicly. He told his girlfriend, his co-workers, his friends, and instantly the game changed. His girlfriend laughed, said he was being dramatic. His co-workers teased him, saying he was trying too hard. Perfect. Every voice became fuel, because every morning, when he wanted to quit, he wasn't just wrestling with fatigue. He was wrestling with the shame of admitting failure to the people who were watching. And here's the brutal truth. Shame is stronger than motivation. Motivation is a chemical trickle. Shame is primal. Our ancestors who lost standing in the tribe didn't just feel embarrassed, they often died. That survival instinct still lives in your nervous system. When you risk your reputation, your brain treats quitting like death. That's why Ichigo didn't fold on day 3, when his alarm went off, and his body screamed to stay in bed. He wasn't just skipping meditation. He was risking humiliation. This is where most people get stuck. They keep chasing motivation, wondering why it never lasts. They don't realize that motivation was never designed to last. It's a spark, not a system. The system comes from making your practice irreversible, from locking the door on negotiation before it begins. That's why public declaration, social skin in the game, and written vows are so powerful. They transform fragile motivation into unbreakable compulsion. But here's the catch. Even when the vow is strong, even when your reputation is at stake, you're still fighting biology. Your body doesn't care about shame. It doesn't care about reputation. At 5 a.m., your nervous system still begs for sleep. And no matter how much you want to keep your promise, biology can still break you. That's why Ichigo needed the second principle, a rule that stripped biology itself of its weapon. Because the vow ends the negotiation, but it doesn't end the fight. Dogen's next principle does. Fixed timing removes negotiation. The first vow stopped Ichigo from negotiating whether he would practice. But there was still a second battlefield, when, every morning, his brain searched for cracks in the system. Maybe after breakfast, maybe before bed, maybe I'll shift it to weekends instead of weekdays. Each tiny debate drained his energy before the practice even began. And here's what most people don't realize. Your brain burns glucose on decisions. Every choice you make costs fuel. That's why you feel exhausted after a day of pointless meetings. It isn't the work that drains you. It's the constant choosing. When should I start? What should I eat? Which email should I answer first? Your brain leaks energy on meaningless decisions, leaving nothing for the actions that actually matter. Dogen solved this problem centuries ago. He created the Ishinji, the monastic regulations for Ishin Temple. The rules were mercilessly precise. Monks rise at 3:30 a.m. Not 3:25, not 3:35. The same bell rings at the same moment, every single day, for over 800 years. And you know what those monks never did? Lie in bed wondering if they should sleep in. The debate didn't exist. The time was fixed. The question had been murdered before it could be asked. Neuroscience confirms what Dogen already knew. The brain stops questioning what never changes. When an action happens at the same time, every day, the nervous system rewires it from conscious choice to unconscious expectation. This is called habit entrainment. It's the reason you feel hungry at noon, even if you haven't eaten breakfast. It's the reason you feel drowsy at midnight, even if you drank coffee. Your body is a clock, and clocks don't argue. Ichigo applied this principle to his vow. He didn't pick 5 a.m. because he loved mornings or sunrises. He picked it because the world was asleep. No texts, no emails, no distractions, and most importantly, no excuses. He removed time as a variable. It wasn't about optimization. It was about elimination. When you lock the time, you kill the debate. The first week was brutal. His body fought him every morning. At 5 a.m. Every muscle begged him to stay in bed. That's normal. When you force your body into a new pattern, it rebels like a prisoner rattling the bars of a cage. But then something strange happened. By the second week, Ichigo started waking up 2 minutes before his alarm. His body was anticipating what his mind had declared inevitable. By day 14, his feet hit the floor before his conscious thoughts even formed. The decision was gone. The movement happened automatically. This is the secret most people never grasp about fixed timing. It isn't about finding the perfect hour. It's about making time non-negotiable. When you do something at random times, you're forcing your brain to make a fresh decision every single day, and every decision is a chance to fail. But when the time is locked, your brain stops asking questions. It becomes like gravity, unchangeable, unquestioned. Think about it in modern terms. Navy SEALs don't ask themselves when to start Hell Week. Olympic sprinters don't decide if practice will be morning or night. The bell rings, the whistle blows, and the practice begins. There is no choice. That's why they're consistent, and you're not. You're still wasting glucose debating when to start. By the time you act, your fuel is gone. But even after Ichigo solved the question of time, a new loophole emerged. At 5 a.m., his body was awake, his space was ready, but his brain found another point of negotiation. What should I do today? Some mornings he meditated, other mornings he read, sometimes he did push-ups. He had eliminated the when, but not the what. The negotiation had simply moved to a new battlefield. And this is where Dogen's teachings became even more controversial. Because his next principle demands something modern culture hates: repetition without variation. One form, practiced relentlessly, until resistance itself collapses. A practice so consistent that your brain finally surrenders, because there's nothing left to argue about. But this is where people push back. They say variety keeps things interesting. They say doing the same thing every day will make you robotic, boring, obsessive. And maybe they're right. But here's the paradox. It's exactly that robotic repetition that turns practice into identity. It's the same paradox that explains why masters, from jiu-jitsu fighters to pianists to arm wrestlers, repeat the same motion thousands of times until the body moves without thought. Ishigo was about to learn the most painful truth of all. Consistency doesn't die when you're lazy. It dies when you leave space for choice. And the only way to kill choice is through a single, unchanging form. One form practice. Or variety feels exciting. It feels modern. Every fitness influencer tells you to switch it up so you don't get bored. Every productivity guru promises endless hacks. One day meditation, the next day journaling, maybe cold showers when you feel edgy. And yet, look around. Endless variety hasn't made people consistent. It's made them scattered, dabbling in 20 things, mastering none. Variety is not the path to mastery. Variety is where consistency goes to die. Dogen knew this when he taught shikantaza: just sitting, not sitting, and visualizing your goals. Not sitting and planning your next project. Just sitting. One form, no variation, no negotiation. Repetition until the mind itself surrenders. Modern psychology agrees. Every time you change your activity, your brain has to make a new micro-decision: push-ups or burpees. This book or that one. 10 minutes or 20. Each tiny decision is another crack where resistance seeps back in, and resistance never misses a chance to crawl through the cracks. Ichigo learned this the hard way. At 5 a.m., he was consistent. He woke up, no questions asked. But once he was awake, the debate began. Maybe I'll read today instead of meditating. Maybe I'll swap push-ups for planks. Maybe I'll just stretch this morning and call it progress. On paper, he was showing up. In reality, his practice was chaos. Every variation reopened the negotiation he had tried so hard to eliminate. The time was fixed, but the form was still fragile. So he made a decision that scared even him. He locked it down completely. 20 push-ups, 10 minutes of meditation, 10 minutes of reading, same order, same timer, no substitutions, no flexibility. His personal ango retreat, 90 days of identical practice. His friends called it robotic. His girlfriend said he was becoming boring. Perfect. They didn't understand that boring was the entire point. Because boring is where the transformation happens. Week 3, his mind went to war. Every morning it screamed, "This is pointless. You're not a machine. You'll burn out if you don't mix it up." But that wasn't the voice of truth. It was the voice of resistance, clawing for survival. Week 4, something broke. Not his discipline, his resistance. The voice that once roared began to whisper. The arguments grew weaker. By week 6, something even stranger happened. Ichigo would be halfway through his push-ups before he consciously realized he had started. The practice had started to execute itself. His body had learned the sequence like a dancer learns choreography. This is the stage beginners never reach because they quit too soon. They mistake resistance for truth. They mistake boredom for failure. But every master will tell you the same story. The arm wrestling champion who drills the same hook thousands of times. The jiu-jitsu legend who still repeats the guard pass he learned on day 1. The pianist who practices scales long after she can play symphonies. Variety is for amateurs. Masters return to the basics, over and over, until the basics become unconscious. That is the doorway to competence, so deep it looks like magic. Neuroscience calls it automaticity. When a behavior becomes so ingrained that the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making center of your brain, shuts off. The sequence bypasses thought, and when there's no thought, there's no negotiation. That's why true consistency is never built on novelty. It's built on brutal repetition of the same form, until even boredom gives up and leaves you alone. Ichigo didn't realize it at the time, but this was the most important shift of his life. He was no longer practicing discipline. Discipline was practicing him. He wasn't trying to control the routine. The routine had begun to control him. And that's when life threw its first curveball. On day 35, he got hit with the flu. The kind that fogs your brain, weakens your body, makes every movement feel impossible. Old Ichigo would have quit. Old Ichigo would have said, "I'll restart when I'm healthy." But the new Ichigo had something else, an unbroken sequence. Even sick, he rolled out of bed, dropped to the floor, did 10 shaky push-ups, meditated through fever sweats. Read a single page. It wasn't perfect, but it was continuity. On day 40, travel disrupted him again. Airports at dawn, meetings all day, no gym, no quiet space. Old Ichigo would have said, "This day doesn't count. I'll get back on track when I'm home." But new Ichigo dropped to the floor of an airport bathroom. Push-ups, breathing meditation in an Uber, reading on the plane. Strangers stared. He didn't care, because the form mattered more than the environment. This is where most people fail. They treat practice like a fragile flower that needs perfect sunlight, perfect soil, perfect water, but perfect conditions don't exist. And when your system requires perfection, it collapses the moment life gets messy. Dogen's teaching about one form wasn't about being rigid. It was about building a pattern so deeply ingrained that even chaos couldn't interrupt it. And yet, there was still one more trap waiting. Even with a vow, even with a fixed time, even with a single form repeated every day, Ichigo was about to collide with the deadliest enemy of all gaps. The small cracks in practice where everything you built can collapse overnight. No gap practice. Most people think laziness is what destroys consistency, but it isn't. Laziness is obvious. You see it. You fight it. The real killer is the gap. That single missed day that opens the door for your old self to come flooding back in. You think it's just one time. It won't matter, but it always matters. Because the moment the river stops flowing, it's no longer a river. It's a puddle pretending to be alive. Dogen wrote that practice must continue without even a moment's gap, because in that gap, the seeds of your weakness sprout again. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing a psychological law. The human brain doesn't reset to neutral. It resets to old patterns. That's why missing one day so often turns into missing a week, then a month, then a year. The gap reawakens the identity you worked so hard to bury. Think about how often you've said it yourself. If I can't do the full workout, why bother? If I can't meditate for 20 minutes, why waste 5? That's not logic. That's perfectionism, disguised as reason. And perfectionism has killed more progress than laziness ever could. Because laziness quits openly. Perfectionism quits with excuses that sound noble. I only want to do it right. No, you want a loophole. Elite athletes know the difference. They take rest days, but those rest days are strategy. Planned, precise, designed to make tomorrow's training even harder. That's not a gap. That's progress. But when you skip because you're tired, or busy, or not in the mood, that isn't rest. That's retreat. And retreat always turns into surrender. Ichigo hit this wall at day 35, when the flu knocked him down. The old version of him would have said, "This doesn't count. I'll restart when I'm better." But restarting is a trap. Restarting means the gap already won. So instead, he scaled down but didn't stop. 10 push-ups, even if they were sloppy. 1 minute of meditation, even if his mind wandered. A single page of reading, even if he barely remembered the words. The form shrank, but it never broke. He kept the river flowing. Airports at dawn, meetings stacked back to back. No quiet room, no gym. Old Ichado would have surrendered to impossible circumstances. But new Ichado understood Dogen's law. No gaps. So he adapted. Push-ups in the airport bathroom. Reading on the plane while people stared. None of it was perfect. But perfection was never the point. Continuity was. And here's the uncomfortable truth. People will call this obsessive. They'll say, normal people don't do push-ups in an airport bathroom. Good. Because normal people get normal results. They live in cycles of excitement and collapse. Always restarting, never arriving. When your consistency starts to make people uncomfortable, that's the signal you're finally doing it right. This is the paradox of no-gap practice. It doesn't require perfection. It only requires persistence. A river doesn't rage every single day. Sometimes it's a flood. Sometimes it's a trickle. But it never stops moving forward. That's why it carves canyons. Not with force, but with continuity. Your practice is the same. Even when sick, even when tired, even when traveling, you never stop moving. Because once you stop, you're not practicing anymore. You're just someone who used to practice. And this is where most people misunderstand growth. They think switching equals progress. Meditation is hard. I'll journal instead. Journaling feels boring. I'll try cold showers. Cold showers are uncomfortable. I'll switch to running. But switching isn't movement. It's wandering. And wandering never takes you anywhere worth reaching. True movement means heading toward the same destination. Even when the road twists. Even when obstacles block the way. Even when detours confuse you. The point is not perfection. The point is never stopping. That's why Ichado's identity began to shift. When he did push-ups in the bathroom, he wasn't just keeping a streak alive. He was proving to himself that practice was no longer something he chose to do. It was something that happened. No matter what. His co-workers noticed. His friends whispered that he was becoming obsessive. His girlfriend told him he was acting unnatural. Perfect. That discomfort was proof that his practice had crossed into the territory where average people couldn't follow. But here's the catch. Not all obstacles can be predicted. You can prepare for sickness. You can prepare for travel. But life has a way of throwing chaos you didn't see coming. Your child gets sick. Your car breaks down. Your boss keeps you late. These are the killers of consistency, because you haven't pre-decided how to face them. And in that moment of stress, you always choose the path of least resistance. That's where the next principle becomes lethal. Because Dogen didn't just demand continuity. He demanded pre-solved responses. A system so unbreakable that even the unexpected couldn't break it. Pre-solved responses. Most people think discipline is built in the moment of action. They believe it comes down to willpower. When life throws chaos at you, you simply power through. But that's a lie. In the heat of stress, your brain almost always chooses the easiest path. That's not weakness, it's biology. Under stress, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational planning, shuts down. Your body flips into survival mode, and survival mode never chooses the hard road. It always chooses comfort. That's why people relapse under pressure. Not because they're lazy, but because they didn't prepare before the chaos hit. Dogen understood this long before neuroscience proved it. Zen monasteries have operated for centuries without missing a single day of practice. Earthquakes, wars, famines, even fires that destroyed their meditation halls. And still, the bell rang. Still, monks sat. How? They didn't wait to make decisions in the middle of chaos. The response was already written. If the meditation hall floods, move to the dining hall. If the dining hall burns, sit in the courtyard. No debate, no meeting, no vote, just action. The practice never negotiates with chaos. Ichigo saw how powerful this was. He looked back on every time his consistency had died in the past, and he realized it wasn't laziness, it was unpreparedness. He got sick and didn't know what to do. He traveled and had no plan. A guest stayed over, and he didn't want to look weird. Each time the obstacle wasn't the real problem. The lack of a pre-solved response was, so he made a list. Every obstacle that had ever broken him before, written down. And beside each obstacle, he wrote its predetermined response. If it rains and the garage is wet, push-ups in the hallway. If guests are over and space is tight, bathroom workout, quiet meditation. If he's hungover, which shouldn't happen, but sometimes did, 2 push-ups. 1 minute of meditation, 1 page of reading. Minimal, but never zero. If traveling with no gym, bodyweight exercises in the airport, meditation in an Uber, reading on the plane. It didn't matter what happened. If X occurs, I do Y. No thought, no decision, no negotiation, just execution. And something strange happened. Once the responses were written, the stress of what if vanished. He no longer wasted energy fearing disruptions, because disruptions were already accounted for. That certainty rewired his nervous system. Instead of treating obstacles like battles, he treated them like background noise. He didn't fear chaos anymore, because chaos had no vote. This is the real power of pre-solving. It doesn't just maintain the streak, it removes decision fatigue. Every time you make a decision, your brain spends energy. Every time you debate, you burn fuel. But when the response is predetermined, the brain relaxes. It knows what to do, and that calm carries over into the rest of life. You stop living in constant negotiation and start living in automatic execution. By day 70, Ichigo wasn't thinking about his practice at all. His body just moved through the sequence like a machine running code. Some mornings he'd finish his push-ups without even remembering starting. His girlfriend's mother stayed for a week, and he still got up at 5 a.m., slipping quietly into the bathroom to complete the practice. She thought he was strange, but to him, strange had become normal. And here's the paradox. The more predictable his practice became, the more unpredictable his results became. His co-workers noticed he seemed sharper, calmer, more composed. His friends said he was becoming obsessive. One even said his discipline was scary. Perfect. Because when your consistency becomes unnerving to others, it means you've reached a level beyond their imagination. This is what people never understand. Discipline isn't about heroic effort in the moment. It's about removing the moment altogether. Pre-solving means you never have to choose again. You've already chosen, and once the choice is locked, chaos loses its power. But there's one final transformation waiting. Because vows fixed timing, one form, no gaps, and pre-solved responses don't just create consistency, they create identity. At some point, the practice stops being something you do, it becomes something you are. And that's when the world begins to fear you. Because consistency at this level doesn't just produce results, it produces a person who cannot do otherwise. When consistency becomes fearsome, there's a stage in discipline nobody prepares you for. At first, people cheer for you. They clap when you start going to the gym. They smile when you say you're meditating. They applaud when you start eating cleaner, but keep going long enough. And the cheers turn into whispers. Admiration curdles into discomfort. Suddenly, the same people who praised you begin to say you're obsessed, robotic, unhealthy. Why? Because your consistency is no longer inspiring them. It's exposing them. Humans live in tribes, and tribes thrive on sameness. When one person breaks away, when one person shows that the impossible is actually possible, the tribe feels threatened. Your very existence becomes a mirror, reflecting their weakness. That's why Ichigo's co-workers stopped teasing and started whispering. That's why his girlfriend shifted from amused to uneasy. It wasn't about him. It was about what his discipline revealed in them. They couldn't pretend anymore that consistency was unattainable. He was proving it wasn't, and that truth made them uncomfortable. History repeats this pattern over and over. Musashi, the wandering swordsman, terrified his rivals not only with his skill, but with his unbroken devotion to practice. Kobe Bryant's Mamba mentality earned him respect, but also resentment. Teammates called him obsessive, unbalanced, even toxic. Nikola Tesla was mocked as insane for working 18-hour days, sleeping on laboratory floors. What all these figures had in common was simple. Their consistency had crossed a threshold. It had become fearsome. Fearsome consistency changes the way the world sees you. To outsiders, it looks inhuman. They can't grasp how someone can do the same practice every single day without breaking. They assume you must be miserable, trapped, a slave to routine. What they don't see is that at this level, practice is no longer effort, it's identity. Ichigo wasn't forcing himself to meditate anymore. He had become a man who meditates. He wasn't dragging himself through push-ups. He had become the kind of man who does them regardless of time, place, or mood. And when something is identity, it stops being optional. This is the real secret of Dogen's Gwoji. Practice without gaps isn't about doing something every day. It's about becoming someone who cannot do otherwise. A river doesn't flow because it feels like it. It flows because that's what rivers do. When your practice reaches this level, you stop asking questions. You stop debating. You stop trying. You simply exist as the practice itself. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because once you've reached this level, you can't go back. The same friends who once encouraged you will now call you extreme. Strangers will warn you about balance. They'll tell you to slow down, to loosen up, to live a little. But listen carefully. What they're really saying is, stop making me feel small. Stop reminding me of what I could be. Your discipline is no longer personal. It has become a confrontation. And this is why most people will never follow this path. They can handle doing something for 30 days. They can survive a 90-day streak. But they can't handle the social isolation that comes when others start to see them as different. When people start to whisper that your consistency is unnatural, dangerous, even threatening, that's the true test. Will you retreat back into the comfort of mediocrity just to fit in? Or will you embrace the fact that greatness always looks obsessive to the average? Ichigo chose the second path. On day 90, he completed his Ango retreat. 90 days of unbroken practice. But the real victory wasn't the streak, it was the transformation. He was no longer a man trying to be consistent. He was consistency embodied. And when his friends told him his discipline was scary, he smiled. Because they were right. True discipline should scare people. It should disturb them. It should force them to question everything they believe about their own limits. This is the final stage of the system. You start with a vow that ends negotiation. You fix the time, so biology has no argument. You repeat one form until the mind surrenders. You eliminate gaps so the river never stops flowing. You pre-solve obstacles so chaos loses its power. And finally, you embrace the fearsome identity that emerges. The kind of existence that proves what others say is impossible, is only uncomfortable. Because here's the truth. You don't need balance. You don't need variety. You don't need motivation. You need the kind of discipline that makes others uneasy. You need the kind of consistency that rewires your identity so deeply that quitting feels unthinkable. When that happens, you'll know you've crossed the line. You'll know you've become something rare, something relentless, something unbreakable. And the next time someone tells you your discipline is unhealthy, obsessive, or robotic, smile, because that's the signal you've finally arrived. becoming someone who cannot do otherwise. We live in a world addicted to shortcuts. Youthful want morning routines that fit in 15 minutes. They want motivational speeches that give them goosebumps. They want apps that promise discipline with push notifications. They want apps that promise discipline with push notifications. And yet, despite all these tools, society has never been more inconsistent. New diets rise and die within weeks. Gym memberships collect dust after January. Books are half finished, businesses half built, dreams half lived. The modern world doesn't suffer from lack of opportunity. It suffers from lack of continuity. That's why Dogen's teaching feels so radical today. He wasn't talking about trying harder. He wasn't selling hacks or inspiration. He was describing a transformation so complete that practice continues by itself. Not because you're motivated, not because you're disciplined, but because you've become someone who cannot do otherwise. Ichigo's journey proves this truth. He didn't start as a monk or a warrior. He started as a normal man, ambitious but scattered, motivated but fragile. Every system he tried collapsed the same way. Strong at the beginning, dead by the end of the week. But once he followed Dogen's 5 principles, the cycle broke. The vow ended negotiation. The fixed time ended decision fatigue. The one form silenced resistance. The no-gap rule prevented collapse. The pre-solved responses disarmed chaos. And together, they forged something new. Identity. That's the secret nobody wants to hear. Discipline isn't about forcing yourself forever. Willpower doesn't last. Motivation collapses, but identity doesn't argue. Identity doesn't quit. When you become the practice itself, it flows like a river through sickness, through chaos, through ridicule. You don't think about it anymore. You don't debate it anymore. You simply live it. And this is why people fear consistency. Not because it's unhealthy, but because it exposes them. Your unbroken pattern reminds them of every time they quit. Your identity as someone who cannot stop makes their excuses look like lies. They'll call you obsessive to make themselves feel balanced. They'll call you robotic to excuse their own chaos. They'll say you need to slow down. Not because you do, but because they can't speed up. And when they call your discipline scary, remember, they're right. It is scary because it reveals just how much of life is wasted in negotiation, in hesitation, in surrender. So the question isn't, how do I stay motivated? The question is, when will I finally stop needing motivation at all? When will you stop treating consistency like a choice and start treating it like your nature? When will you stop being someone who practices and start being someone who is the practice? The truth is, the world doesn't need more people chasing motivation. It doesn't need more people dabbling in variety, switching when things get hard, restarting after every failure. The world needs more people who terrify others with their relentlessness. People who treat practice not as a hobby, but as existence. People whose discipline is so unshakable that it becomes identity. That's the final evolution. You don't need balance. You don't need variety. You don't even need motivation. You need to become the kind of person who cannot do otherwise. And when you reach that level, when your consistency unsettles the people around you, when your discipline is so unnatural it feels inhuman, that's when you know you've crossed the threshold. Because ordinary people chase motivation. Extraordinary people build identity, and identity never negotiates. So the next time someone tells you you're obsessive, robotic, or unbalanced, smile. They're telling you the truth. They're telling you you've become something rare, something dangerous, something unbreakable. And that's the entire point.